Welcome everyone to a Powerhouse San Pedro historical and cultural look at the book of Matthew. So this class tonight is not just about what's in the book of Matthew, but we're going to look at why it's there, why they're even, especially why certain words and phrases and references were used from Jesus and from Matthew. So get ready to learn some things that you may have not realized before. Tonight, we look at the Sermon on the Mount. Tonight, I have only two pieces to add to our wealth of knowledge that we are building on this foundational backdrop. So here's the first piece. We find the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5, and it's actually chapter 5 through 7 in Matthew. So Matthew is also a synoptic gospel. I mentioned this before, but synoptic gospels is where you will find the same stories in a different gospel, and sometimes with a different view. Matthew's Sermon on the Mount has a synoptic parallel in Luke. And Luke tells the same story, but Luke calls it the Sermon on the Plain. That's interesting. So, so we're in the Greek, that word, it simply means a grounded place, a place where you can get a secure footing. So you can. So we're gonna look at that. So in Luke's version, in Luke 6, Jesus is in the exact opposite of a mount. And so Luke has Jesus on a plain, and Matthew has him on a mount. So he calls it the Sermon on the Mount. Luke calls it the Sermon on the Plain. So Sermon on the Mount, Sermon on the Plain, which is it? So here's something interesting, and we're gonna find out which it is. In both Matthew and Luke, Jesus is, he's only speaking to his disciples. I don't know if you noticed that, but in the Sermon on the Mount, he's only speaking to his disciples. So I wonder, is it because of the movies that we get this idea that Jesus is like almost yelling at a crowd, preaching on a mountain? Because in the text, it says that on the Sermon on the Mount, that Jesus is just talking to his disciples. And let me show you in Matthew 5:1, it says in the first verse, it says, "And seeing the multitudes, he went up on the mountain. And when he was seated, his disciples came to him. Then he opened his mouth and taught them, saying," and then he said it. And then in Luke, it says that in Luke 6:20 and 21, it says, "Then he lifted up his eyes toward his disciples and said." So both of them are to his disciples. So so go ahead and we're going to be looking at chapter 5. So I'm going to pause just for a second. I need to get my glasses there just so I can see you. I can't see everybody. I only see a few of you, so I think with my glasses I'll see more of you. It's right in the side of the, right there where you're, yeah, there it is. And my assistant, Nicole, will give me my glasses. Thank you. Lovely assistant. All right. Oh, there you are. Wait, I see more of you. Okay, so back to the Sermon on the Mount. So as we look at the Sermon on the Mount, look at it this way. Look at it as Matthew's rendition of Jesus's greatest hits. Because he most likely said this stuff at different times and in different locations. For example, Luke says that it was on a plain that he gave this sermon. Matthew says it was on a mount. So think of it this way. Jesus probably gave the Beatitude teachings several times and in many different places. The book of Romans, and it was taught by Dr. Eno. Dr. Eno was the professor. And I will never forget him telling us students, he would say this, students, don't ever ask God to take away your circumstances. Ask him to take you through your circumstances. Just like that. I will never forget those sayings. Why? Why will I never forget them? Because they were said over and over and over again. When I had Professor Dr. Hammond, I had him in the homiletics class. That's a preaching class. He was teaching us how to preach. And I'll never forget his saying. He said, when you preach, if you don't strike oil in 20 minutes, stop boring. And so why do I remember this? Because he said it to us over and over and over again. Every time we got up to preach, he would say, students, when you preach, if you don't strike oil in 20 minutes, stop boring. And let me say this. Why do most of you remember information plus information equals more information? But information plus application equals transformation. Why do you remember it? It's because you have heard me say that over and over and over and over and over again. I have learned the process and principle of learning through repetition. Hope, faith, trust, rest. I've also learned that instead of emphasizing three different things, it's better to emphasize one thing in three different ways. I think that this method Jesus also used. And that's why Luke calls these teachings the Sermon on the Plain, and Matthew calls these teachings the Sermon on the Mount. Because he probably taught these teachings multiple times in a 3-year span for them to remember all of these. Did you know that all the incidences that we read in the Gospels only add up to about 3 months? Someone tallied that up at one time. 3 months of activity that we read in the Gospels. 3 months of 3 years. And this is why the synoptic Gospels, which is Matthew, Mark, and Luke, have the similar story. That's why when you read Matthew, Mark, or Luke, you will come across similar stories, but they will have different details at times because they're talking from their side. So what Matthew is doing here is that he's condensing some of the teachings of Jesus in these 3 chapters. And he's titling these teachings the Sermon on the Mount. And these are actually multiple teachings. It's like he's just bringing the hits, the greatest teachings of Jesus. Matthew is bringing here, and that's what we'll see in chapter 5, 6, and 7. I wonder how many times Jesus repeated these teachings. I wonder how many times it was over and over and over and over again. I wonder if he said it so much that his disciples were able to finish his line as you do. Information plus information equals more information. But information plus application equals transformation. There's also a really good reason why Matthew puts Jesus on a mountain. If Jesus taught these teachings multiple times in multiple places, why did Jesus put him on a mount? Why a Sermon on the Mount? Who in the Old Testament was on a mountain? Moses. Moses was on a mountain. And this echoes Moses giving the Torah on Mount Sinai. And this serves as the culmination of Jesus as Moses' imagery up to this point. What do I mean by that? Well, Jesus, up to chapter 5 here in Matthew, he has been recapitulating or redoing the life of Moses in his own life. For example, in the first 4 chapters of Matthew's gospel, Jesus escapes being murdered as an infant, as was Moses under Pharaoh. Also, Jesus goes to Egypt and goes back out. And Moses goes to live with an Egyptian family and then comes out of Egypt in the Exodus. Also, both enter and arise from a body of water. The Israelites go through the Red Sea, and Jesus is baptized in the Jordan River. In other words, going through water with a life-changing experience. And then the apex of Moses comes on the top of the mountain, where God speaks to him and gives him the 10 Commandments. So just as Moses was on top of Mount Sinai and giving the law, which is also the Torah, Jesus goes up to a mountain and talks about what? The Torah, the law, and how to interpret it. So this is why Matthew records the time Jesus gave this teaching when he was on a mountain. I'm sure Jesus gave some of these teachings in different places, but I know one of those times was on a mountain, and this is where Matthew places him. So to really, he did this to really show the reader that Jesus is a new Moses figure. So that was the first piece that I wanted to give to you. And so here's the second piece. The Sermon on the Mount begins with what are called the Beatitudes. Now, the Beatitudes is an older way of saying blessings on, or blessed, or blessed. Now, these are modeled from Psalms. Jesus was teaching from what they were already familiar with. Genius. A lot of times a psalm will begin with, blessed is the one who does this or this. The actual word here is ashrei, and in Hebrew it's blessed. And actually, in Hebrew, blessed would be from Baruch, or comes from the root word barak. In the Psalms, the word is ashrei, and this can also easily be translated as happy. And so many of your translations will say, happy is he. And other translations will say, blessed is he. So the Makadeos is the Greek word in Matthew. And it's just the Greek translation of the Hebrew word ashrei. And it could be translated as blessed or happy, either one. In fact, the two words in English are really not that much different. So in this, Jesus is saying that it will go well, or they will have a blessed life if they do this or that. So we can see this formula right away in the first Psalm. I mean, if you turn to Psalm, and you could turn there right now, Psalm chapter 1, verse 1. It starts off with ashrei. It starts off with blessed. Ashrei is, blessed is the one who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked, but whose delight is in the law of the Lord. Now, the word law there is Torah. So it's saying whose delight is in the Torah of the Lord. That's the Hebrew word for law. I think that Jesus is actually drawing the Beatitudes on the Psalms, because it says here it has the blessed formula, and the same is with the beatitude formula that he's using here. So right away, the blessing is on the one who delights in the Torah. So Jesus here is going to start a sermon on the Torah with these Beatitudes. So he's beginning his sermon in the same way the Psalms begin, which is what his listeners were very familiar with. So as we look at the first Beatitude in Matthew, it'll say, blessed is, blessed is, blessed is. So let's look at the fifth one, just for a moment. Matthew chapter 5, verse 5. And it refers to, and it says, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Now in Greek, that word earth is gain. And it's a direct quotation, you guessed it, from the Psalms. And so again, we go back to the Psalms. And so we see that in many places, but we also see it in Psalm 37:11. Psalm 37:11. And it says this, but the meek shall inherit the earth, and shall delight themselves in the abundance of peace. So the meek, the anav, shall inherit the earth. Well, first of all, whenever I would read that, I thought, what do you mean inherit the earth? In Hebrew, that word earth is eretz. And in the Greek, it's the same word that Matthew uses in verse 5. So here's the issue. The English translation tends to reference the whole earth. The original context in the Psalms refers to eretz, the earth, as the land. Eretz specifically refers to the land. And what Matthew is referring to is the land of Israel. So when we read English, we read it, you will inherit the earth. We normally tend to think of the globe or the planet, but that's not what Jesus is thinking here. What he's thinking is, now remember who he's talking to. He's talking to his Jewish disciples. And he's saying, the meek among you shall inherit the land of Israel. So what does that mean? Inherit the land of Israel. Well, on one hand, it can mean that the Israelites coming out of Egypt to inherit the land that they come into. This is in the days of Joshua. But that doesn't make a lot of sense in this case because they're already in the land at this point in Jesus' time. So here it means to hang on to it. It means to live in it peacefully, to live in the land peacefully, to hang on to the land. So that's what Jesus is talking about. That is the meek among you rather than the violent. Well, what is the meek? The meek among you will inherit. Well, the meek among you will inherit this land. Will hold on to this land. The meek, pros, or the humbled or controlled, will inherit the land in peace. So a lot of people think that meek means weak, but it really isn't. The word meek refers to powerful yet controlled. Powerful yet controlled. The picture I get is when Jesus was on the cross and he had all that power, and when they beat him and they crucified him, I mean, he had all the power to just wipe everybody out. And then when he gasped for air, and when he spoke those words, his last words, I wonder if people were wondering if he was going to just wipe everybody out. He had the power to wipe everybody out. He could have just said, you're all gone. But instead he said, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Powerful, yet controlled. So what Jesus might be saying here is that he's telling his disciples in this case, if you get too out of control, if you get violent, the Romans might come in and squash the Jewish people in the land. And obviously Jesus doesn't want that. Unfortunately, that does happen in the year 70 AD. That was about 40 years after Jesus would have given this sermon. But here Jesus is showing his disciples the best point of approach is to remain meek, controlled, humble. So let's go back to that word earth. Now, I gave you the earth, and it means the land. But how do we know that Jesus means land? How do we know that Jesus means the land of Israel? Well, I'm going to show you how, because everything relates to the Old Testament. So there's a verse in Zephaniah. And Zephaniah is one of those shorter prophetic books that are easily forgotten. People, where's Zephaniah? It's just a little one. But Zephaniah chapter 2, verse 3 says this: Seek the Lord, all you meek, anav, of the earth. Seek the Lord, all you meek of the earth. So those are the same words also in Psalm 37. Psalm 37:11 says, but the meek shall inherit the earth, the eretz. Now, I want to read on in Zephaniah, because there's something interesting here. I'm going to read that same verse, but I'm going to go on to all the way to verse 4. Listen to this, because this is what his Jewish disciples would have known when Jesus is referring to this. Zephaniah chapter 2, verse 3 and 4 says, Seek the Lord, all you meek of the earth, who have upheld his justice. Seek righteousness, seek humility. It may be that you will be hidden in the day of the Lord's anger. For Gaza shall be forsaken, and Ashkelon desolate. They shall drive out Ashdod at noonday, and Ekron shall be uprooted. Now, what does all that mean? Or should I say, what is God saying through the prophets here? Through the prophet here. This is what God is saying. God is telling his people, in the land of Israel, in the land of Israel and the surrounding cities around Israel, which are Gaza, Ashkelon, Ekron, these are Philistine outposts that surround the land of Israel. And he's saying that these surrounding cities are not meek. And so they are going to get driven out of their land. So the best thing for the Israelites to do, in light of seeing the Philistines being driven out of their land, is to be meek in their land. So Jesus is also drawing on Zephaniah. That's how we know that Jesus is not talking about the whole earth or the globe or the planet, but that he's talking about the land of Israel. So when we look at these truths, what we're doing is we're building a backdrop, a foundation that we can draw from for the rest of our lives. There are many teachings that you have learned in Matthew and in the Beatitudes, and we're going to continue on. This is just part 1 of the Beatitudes. But I don't want to give too much. I want to take our time and go with and pace, because it's important that we lay down the foundation first. It's important that we draw from this. We know, why did Jesus say this and who is he speaking to? So we know this already, that he's not teaching to a crowd in this case. His sermon is, he's not speaking or shouting out to a bunch of people on a mountain. But what he's doing is he's talking to his disciples. And he must have said this so many times in 3 years, where they know what these teachings are. And I can what's the word? I can relate to this because of the teachings that I have learned from Frank Gonzalez, or from Dr. Hammond or Dr. Eno or different ones, I will never forget some of the phrases and teachings and lines that they said because of repetition. And I think for some of you, you will never forget information plus information equals more information. But information plus application equals transformation. And already some of you can't get out of your mind hope, faith, trust, and rest. These are important things that are not just to be heard once, but are learned and lived. And I trust and I hope that these truths of the word will be lived out in your life, and that you will be able to experience the power of God. Because, see, that's the bottom line, is the power of God. These are not just truths that are just good things to do. These truths will release power in your life. And so I trust that these two pieces of information that we started on will be a good solid backdrop for the rest of the teachings, not only through this class, but the rest of the teachings of the Gospels that you will have for the rest of your life. So I want to thank you for joining us tonight. I want to welcome you to join us on Saturday for a Zoom. You can contact us and text us, and on Sunday at 10 o'clock. Saturdays at 10 o'clock.
Yeah, and if they have to contact us for the Zoom link.
Yeah, so just contact us. We can send you a Zoom link. And for Sunday, though, it's on Instagram, so you just go live just as you're doing now. And just to remind you, for tithes and offerings or donations to support our Powerhouse ministry, you can mail it to Powerhouse Church, Post Office Box 9028, San Pedro, California 90734. And I trust that you will have a great week, a powerful week, as you let these truths just be embedded, not only in your mind, but in your heart. So God bless you, and have a great evening. And I will see you on Saturday, and I'll see you on Sunday. Bye.